The Tudor bricks glow crimson in the fading London light, each one laid by hands that have been dust for nearly 500 years. Here, in the shadow of Buckingham Palace's fame, stands a fortress that has witnessed more coronations, more conspiracies, more royal deaths than any building in Britain. St. James's Palace is not the largest royal residence, not the most famous, not even the official home of the monarch anymore. Yet every British sovereign since 1536 has been proclaimed here. Every court circular still bears its name, and within these ancient walls, the very concept of British monarchy was forged, tested, and nearly destroyed. This is the palace where kings were born and queens died, where Tudor princes played and Stuart monarchs plotted, where the fate of empires was decided in rooms most visitors to London never see. If you're fascinated by the hidden power centers of royalty and want to explore more forgotten palaces that shaped history, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us which royal residence you want us to investigate next. The year is 1536. Henry VIII, already legendary for his vast appetites and violent tempers, stands amid the ruins of what was once the Hospital of St. James for leprous maidens. The hospital has been dissolved, one of countless religious institutions destroyed during Henry's break with Rome. But Henry sees opportunity in these marshy fields on the western edge of London, away from the cramped streets and pestilential air of the old medieval city. He will build a palace here. Not a grand statement of Renaissance magnificence like Hampton Court, which his disgraced minister Cardinal Wolsey built and Henry seized. Not a sprawling complex like Windsor Castle with its centuries of accumulated grandeur. St. James's will be something different, a fortress, a hunting lodge, a private retreat where Henry can escape the formality of court life and the prying eyes of subjects who whisper about his marriage to Anne Boleyn, his break with Rome, his transformation of England from Catholic nation to something new and uncertain. But Henry will never truly escape. St. James's Palace, built as his private sanctuary, will become the stage for some of the most dramatic moments in British royal history. Within these walls, his children will grow up as prisoners and princes, queens will die in childbirth, kings will be proclaimed and deposed, and the very nature of British monarchy will be tested by fire, plague, revolution, and scandal. This is the story of St. James's Palace. Not just a building, but a fortress of power that has stood for nearly 5 centuries, while empires rose and fell around it. It is the story of the monarchs who lived here. Tudors, Stuarts, Hanoverians, each leaving their mark on these ancient walls. It is the story of the architects and craftsmen who built and rebuilt the palace through centuries of change, and the servants who maintained royal splendor while living in cramped quarters and working 16-hour days. Most of all, it is the story of how power really works, not through grand ceremonies in public spaces, but through quiet conversations in private rooms, through marriages arranged in candlelit chambers, through decisions made by monarchs who understood that St. James's Palace, precisely because it was not the grandest or most famous residence, offered something more valuable: privacy, security, and the freedom to shape history away from public scrutiny. Chapter 1. Henry's Fortress. To understand St. James's Palace, you must first understand the man who built it, and the world he was remaking through sheer force of will and violence. Henry VIII in 1536 is 45 years old, entering the final decade of his life, though he cannot know this yet. He is married to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, though this marriage will last only months more. Anne will be executed on charges of adultery and treason in May, and Henry will marry Jane Seymour within weeks. He has broken England away from the Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and unleashed a wave of religious upheaval that will define British history for centuries. He needs palaces, lots of them. A peripatetic court requires multiple residences where the king can stay while servants clean and air out previous lodgings. Henry owns more than 60 properties by the end of his reign, constantly moving between them in elaborate processions that demonstrate royal power while serving practical purposes of hygiene and administration. St. James's Palace begins construction in 1532 and is substantially complete by 1536, though additions and modifications will continue throughout Henry's reign. The site occupies approximately 23 acres of marshy ground west of Westminster, an area then on the very edge of London, surrounded by fields and game parks. Henry's master mason, whose name is lost to history, but whose work survives in the palace's distinctive brickwork, builds not a palace in the Renaissance style beginning to dominate European architecture, but a fortress in the English medieval tradition. The design is purely functional. 4 ranges of buildings arranged around courtyards, surrounded by walls, protected by gates, built to withstand siege. The main entrance, the gatehouse, stands on Pall Mall and remains the palace's most recognizable feature. Built of red brick in the Tudor style, it rises 4 stories high, flanked by octagonal towers topped with battlements. The gate passage runs through the center, wide enough for carriages, protected by massive wooden doors reinforced with iron. Above the entrance, the royal arms of Henry VIII are carved in stone, announcing whose power this building represents. The brickwork throughout the palace is extraordinary, though few modern visitors pause to appreciate it. Tudor bricklayers were masters of their craft, creating patterns and textures through careful placement of bricks in various colors and orientations. The walls of St. James's feature English bond, alternating courses of headers and stretchers, executed with such precision that after nearly 500 years the walls remain plumb and sound. Each brick was handmade in kilns near the construction site, formed in wooden molds, dried in the sun, then fired in massive ovens that burned for days. The work was brutal. Brickmakers and their laborers worked from dawn to dusk during summer months when weather permitted brick production, breathing smoke and dust, suffering burns from the kilns, earning perhaps 3 pence per day for skilled workers, less for laborers. We know almost nothing about these individual workers. Tudor account books record expenses. For bricks, £12,007, but not the names of men who made them. Occasionally, a name surfaces in legal records when a worker was injured or died on site, prompting compensation claims from widows or families. But mostly, the thousands of men who built St. James's Palace remain anonymous. The palace's internal layout followed Tudor conventions. The ground floor contained service areas, kitchens, pantries, storage rooms, workshops. The first floor housed the state apartments where Henry would receive visitors, conduct business, and dine in formal splendor. The second floor provided private apartments for the king, and when in residence, his wife and children. The state apartments were decorated in the elaborate style Henry favored. Timber ceilings painted in bright colors, reds, blues, golds, with carved pendants and royal badges. Walls covered in tapestries depicting hunting scenes, classical myths, and biblical stories. Floors of stone or tile, covered with rushes in winter for warmth, swept clean in summer. The Chapel Royal, located within the palace complex, became one of its most important spaces. Here, Henry and his court would attend daily services, hear sermons, and participate in the elaborate religious rituals that defined Tudor court life. The chapel featured a magnificent timber ceiling, stained glass windows, and furnishings of exceptional quality, though much of this original decoration would be destroyed or modified in later centuries. Henry's own apartments occupied the best position in the palace, with large windows overlooking the gardens and deer park he had created from the marshy fields. These rooms were furnished with the finest available goods: beds with velvet hangings, chairs upholstered in silk, tables of oak and walnut, chests inlaid with ivory and rare woods. But Henry spent relatively little time at St. James's. He preferred Hampton Court for its grandeur, Windsor for its ancient prestige, Greenwich for its river access and hunting. St. James's served primarily as a residence for his children during their youth, and as overflow accommodation when other palaces grew too crowded. Henry's three legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, all spent significant time at St. James's during their childhoods, though under very different circumstances that reflected their changing status in the succession and their father's complicated marital history. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was declared illegitimate after Henry's divorce and break with Rome. She lived at St. James's periodically during the 1530s, sometimes as princess, sometimes as bastard, her status shifting with the political winds. The palace must have felt like a prison during these years, comfortable but confining, luxurious but lonely. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, was also declared illegitimate after her mother's execution. She too resided at St. James's during childhood, educated by the finest tutors, learning languages and courtly skills, while her legitimacy remained contested. Edward, son of Jane Seymour, who died giving birth to him, was the cherished heir, the long-awaited prince who secured the Tudor succession. He was born at Hampton Court in 1537, but spent considerable time at St. James's as a child, protected by layers of servants and guards, his every need attended to by a household numbering in the hundreds. The daily life of these royal children at St. James's followed rigid protocols. They woke early, heard Mass in the Chapel Royal, took lessons from tutors in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, practiced music and dancing, dined formally even in childhood, and went to bed at prescribed hours. Their lives were simultaneously privileged and restricted, surrounded by luxury, but controlled in every detail. Henry VIII died in January 1547, leaving 3 children, multiple palaces, including St. James's, and a religious settlement that satisfied no one. His son Edward became Edward VI at age 9, ruling under the control of regents, who pushed England further toward Protestantism. Edward loved St. James's Palace. Contemporary accounts describe him spending extended periods there, particularly during his final illness. Tuberculosis consumed him slowly over months in 1553, and he spent much of this time confined to his apartments at St. James's, growing weaker while his advisors plotted succession strategies and religious factions maneuvered for position. Edward died at Greenwich Palace, but St. James's remained important to his brief reign. It was at St. James's that he received ambassadors, heard sermons from Protestant reformers, and experienced some of the few happy moments of his short, sickly life. Chapter 2: Stuart Secrets and Civil War. The succession of James I in 1603 brought the Stuart dynasty to the English throne and gave St. James's Palace new significance. James, already King of Scotland, inherited the English crown from the childless Elizabeth I, uniting the two kingdoms under one ruler for the first time. James immediately claimed St. James's as his primary London residence. Unlike the sprawling complexity of Hampton Court or the ancient formality of Westminster, St. James's offered the right combination of comfort, security, and proximity to Westminster, where Parliament met and government business was conducted. James commissioned significant renovations and additions to the palace between 1603 and 1625. He expanded the state apartments, upgraded the Chapel Royal, and improved the private apartments to accommodate his wife, Anne of Denmark, and their children, including the prince who would become Charles I. The Chapel Royal under James became a centre of religious controversy. James was Protestant, but maintained Catholic-style ceremonial practices that alarmed Puritan reformers. The chapel's decoration, its music, its rituals, all became subjects of intense debate, reflecting larger tensions about the direction of English religion. But St. James's is most significant for the Stuart dynasty because of what happened there during the reign of Charles I, James's son, who succeeded in 1625 and would lose both his throne and his head before the century's midpoint. Charles I loved St. James's with a passion that approached obsession. He undertook extensive renovations, hiring Inigo Jones, England's first great Renaissance architect, to modernize and beautify the palace. Jones, who had studied in Italy and absorbed the principles of classical architecture from Palladio and other masters, brought continental sophistication to the Tudor fortress. Jones designed new interiors for the state apartments, replacing medieval decoration with classical proportions and Renaissance ornament. He created a new Queen's Chapel for Charles's Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, a separate building within the palace complex featuring revolutionary architectural ideas, including the first Venetian window in England. The Queen's Chapel, completed in 1627, represents a turning point in English architecture. Jones designed a perfect classical space based on the proportions of a double cube. The interior measures 60 feet long by 30 feet wide by 30 feet high, creating harmonious spatial relationships that would influence British architecture for centuries. The ceiling is a coffered barrel vault painted white and gold. The walls are divided by pilasters in the Doric order, and the east end features a magnificent Venetian window, a large arched central window flanked by smaller rectangular openings, a motif Jones had seen in Palladio's designs. But even as Charles beautified St. James's, political and religious tensions were destroying his reign. His attempts to rule without parliament, his marriage to a Catholic princess, his support for high church Anglican practices that looked too Catholic to Puritan critics, all these created opposition that would explode into civil war. In 1642, Charles left London as parliamentary forces took control of the capital. St. James's Palace was seized by Parliament and used to house prisoners and hold military meetings. The king's beautiful decorations, his art collection, his furnishings, all were dispersed, sold, or destroyed. Charles was executed in January 1649 outside Whitehall Palace, but his body was brought to St. James's for preparation before burial at Windsor. The king's corpse lay in state in the palace where he had commissioned such beautiful additions, where his children had been born, where he had prayed in Inigo Jones's chapel. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. The palace he loved became the staging ground for his final journey. During the Commonwealth period from 1649 to 1660, St. James's Palace lost its royal associations. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector, occasionally used it for meetings, but preferred Hampton Court. The palace fell into disrepair, its maintenance neglected, its rooms repurposed for parliamentary business. The restoration of 1660 brought Charles II to the throne and returned St. James's to royal use. Charles made Whitehall Palace his primary residence, but used St. James's frequently, particularly for private assignations. Charles was notorious for his numerous mistresses, and St. James's offered convenient privacy for romantic intrigues. But St. James's truly returned to prominence under James II, Charles's brother, who succeeded in 1685. James was openly Catholic, a fact that terrified Protestant England and would ultimately cost him his throne. He worshipped in the Queen's Chapel at St. James's, celebrating Catholic Mass in Inigo Jones's beautiful space, while Protestant courtiers and politicians plotted his removal. James's brief reign ended in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when Parliament invited his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange to take the throne. James fled to France, and William and Mary became joint monarchs. Chapter 3. Fire, Rebirth, and Georgian Splendor. St. James's Palace's greatest crisis came not from war or revolution, but from fire. On January 10, 1709, A massive fire destroyed large sections of the palace, consuming the state apartments, damaging the chapel royal and threatening the entire complex. The fire started in a chimney in the apartment of a palace official named William Brunker. Contemporary accounts describe flames spreading rapidly through the timber ceilings and wooden panelling that filled the Tudor structure. Palace residents and nearby Londoners formed bucket chains to fight the blaze, but the fire burned for hours before being controlled. When morning came, much of Henry VIII's original palace lay in ruins. The gatehouse survived, as did portions of the outer walls and some newer buildings, including the Queen's Chapel. But the heart of the palace, the state apartments where monarchs had lived and ruled for nearly 2 centuries, was destroyed. The fire's aftermath revealed the vulnerability of even royal power. Here was a palace built to project eternal strength, yet consumed by flames in a single night. Contemporary accounts describe Queen Anne viewing the smoking ruins, ordering immediate action to rebuild, while her health continued its steady decline. Queen Anne, who had succeeded William and Mary in 1702, commissioned Christopher Wren, the aging master architect who had rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral after the Great Fire of London, to design a replacement. Wren, then in his late 70s, and near the end of his extraordinary career, approached the St. James's Commission with the accumulated wisdom of decades of architectural practice. Wren created plans for a magnificent Baroque palace that would have transformed St. James's into one of Europe's great royal residences, rivaling Versailles in France or Schönbrunn in Austria. His vision featured grand courtyards, monumental staircases, state apartments of unprecedented scale and magnificence, all designed according to the classical principles he had perfected at St. Paul's and dozens of other buildings. The plans survive in archives, testament to what might have been. Drawings show elaborate facades with columns and pediments, complex roof structures supporting domes and cupolas, interiors designed with the geometric precision and harmonious proportions that defined Wren's mature style. Had this palace been built, British architectural history would look very different. But Wren's grand vision was never realized. The costs were staggering, perhaps £300,000 or more, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Anne's health was failing. She had no direct heirs to benefit from such investment, and political support for massive royal expenditure was lacking in an age when parliamentary power was increasing and royal authority declining. Instead, Wren designed more modest replacements for the destroyed state apartments, working within the constraints of the surviving Tudor walls and foundations. This practical approach, rebuilding within existing footprints rather than wholesale replacement, saved enormous sums while preserving the palace's historic character. Wren's compromise solution, completed around 1711, represented architectural sophistication adapted to pragmatic constraints. He could not create the palace he envisioned, but he could create something elegant within the limitations imposed by budget, politics, and existing structures. The new state apartments featured Wren's characteristic attention to proportion and detail. Room heights were calculated according to harmonic ratios. The ceiling height bore specific mathematical relationships to room length and width, creating spaces that felt inherently balanced. Windows were positioned to maximize natural light while maintaining wall strength and thermal efficiency. Fireplaces were designed with improved chimneys that drew smoke efficiently, reducing the fire risk that had destroyed the original apartments. The interiors were finished to standards befitting royal use, though constrained by the modest budget. The ceilings were plastered and painted with allegorical scenes and architectural ornament executed by leading decorative painters. The themes, classical gods and goddesses, personifications of virtues, scenes from British history, created visual programs that reinforced messages about royal authority and legitimacy. The walls were panelled in oak or covered with silk damask and tapestries. Oak panelling was particularly favored for its durability and the warm, dignified atmosphere it created. The panels were carved with simple moldings and enrichments that added visual interest without excessive cost. The wood came from English oak forests, the panels fabricated by London joiners working to Wren's exacting specifications. Textile wall coverings offered different aesthetic possibilities. Silk damask woven with elaborate patterns in rich colors, crimson, blue, gold, created luxurious surfaces that softened the hard geometry of rooms and absorbed sound, making conversation easier. These textiles were expensive, imported from France or Italy, where weaving techniques produced patterns of extraordinary complexity. Tapestries represented the most expensive wall coverings, each one a work of art requiring years to produce. A full set of tapestries for a state apartment might cost thousands of pounds and depict elaborate scenes from mythology or history, with figures and landscapes rendered in wool and silk thread with almost painterly detail. The floors in Wren's state apartments were typically oak boards polished to a warm glow, then covered with carpets. Turkish and Persian carpets were particularly prized, hand-knotted wool in complex patterns, some taking years to complete, shipped across thousands of miles to reach London. These carpets were valuable enough that they were carefully stored when not in use, protected from wear and fading. Fireplaces in each room provided heat, essential in the draughty palace and cold British climate. Wren designed marble fireplaces with classical surrounds, pilasters, and entablatures in miniature, decorated with carved ornament appropriate to each room's character. The marble came from quarries across Europe, white marble from Carrara in Italy, coloured marbles from France and Belgium, creating variety and visual richness. The chimneys were carefully engineered to prevent the kind of fire that had destroyed the original apartments. Wren understood that fires in 17th and 18th century buildings typically started from sparks escaping poorly designed chimneys, or from soot accumulation igniting inside flues. His chimneys featured improved designs with smooth interior surfaces, strategic bends to prevent sparks from travelling upward, and access points for sweeps to clean them thoroughly. Lighting in the rebuilt apartments came primarily from windows and candles. Wren positioned windows to maximize daylight while maintaining the room's proportions and the building's structural integrity. Large windows with multiple panes of glass, expensive but increasingly common in grand buildings, flooded rooms with light during the day. At night, candles provided illumination. Hundreds of candles might burn during evening receptions, their flames multiplied by mirrors and polished surfaces, creating a warm glow that flattered complexions and made the rooms feel magical. But candles were expensive. Good wax candles cost several shillings each, and a major court function might consume dozens or hundreds, representing substantial expense. Chandelle Queen Anne died in 1714, before fully enjoying Wren's renovations. The throne passed to George I, a German prince from Hanover with minimal English and even less interest in British culture. George preferred his mistresses and his ministers to the elaborate court ceremonies that previous monarchs had maintained. St. James's under the early Hanoverians became primarily a ceremonial and administrative centre rather than a residence. The monarchs lived elsewhere. George I and George II preferred Kensington Palace. George III eventually favoured Buckingham House, but St. James's remained the official seat of the court. This meant that all official business was conducted in the name of the court of St. James's. Foreign ambassadors were accredited to the court of St. James's, not to the monarch personally. Royal proclamations were issued from St. James's. The palace became the legal and ceremonial centre of the monarchy, even as the monarchs themselves lived elsewhere. The state apartments, rebuilt by Wren and enhanced by later architects, served for formal receptions, presentations of debutantes to court, and other ceremonial functions. These rooms saw little daily life, but immense historical significance. This was where the machinery of monarchy operated, where aristocrats jockeyed for position, where the social hierarchies of Georgian England were performed and reinforced. The Georgian court at St. James's followed elaborate protocols inherited from Tudor and Stuart predecessors, but elaborated to Baroque complexity. There were specific days for levees, formal receptions where gentlemen were presented to the king, drawing rooms, events where ladies were presented to the queen, birthday celebrations for the monarch and royal family, investitures where honours were bestowed. Each event followed prescribed choreography. Courtiers wore specific dress, men in velvet coats, silk breeches and powdered wigs, women in elaborate gowns with wide panniers and towering hairstyles. Bows and curtsies were performed at precise angles. Speech followed formal patterns, with titles used correctly and conversational topics carefully selected. Behind this ceremonial splendor, St. James's Palace functioned as a complex administrative machine. Hundreds of people worked there, not just servants in the traditional sense, but court officials, government functionaries, and various hangers-on who had secured positions through patronage or family connections. The Lord Chamberlain's department managed the court's ceremonial functions. The Board of Greencloth oversaw household finances and logistics. Various officers, the Master of the Horse, the Master of the Robes, the Comptroller of the Household, each commanded their own staffs and competed for influence and resources. Below these officials laboured the actual working staff, footmen, pages and servants who attended on the royal family and courtiers, cooks, kitchen staff and scullions who prepared the elaborate meals served at court functions, stable hands who cared for horses and maintained carriages, housemaids who cleaned rooms and maintained furnishings, laundresses who washed the endless quantities of linen that Georgian luxury demanded. These workers lived primarily in cramped attic spaces or in attached buildings around the palace courtyards. They worked long hours, often 16 or more per day during busy periods, for modest wages supplemented by tips and the prestige of royal employment. Many servants came from established court families, positions passing from parent to child across generations. We know more about St. James's Palace servants from the Georgian period than from earlier centuries because more records survive. Account books list wages paid. Household regulations specify duties and standards. Occasional memoirs or letters provide glimpses of servant life. One such account comes from Thomas Wilson, a page at St. James's during George II's reign. Wilson's letters to his family in Yorkshire describe a world of strict hierarchy and constant work. He rose at 5 in the morning to prepare rooms before the court awakened. He attended on courtiers throughout the day, running errands, delivering messages, assisting with everything from dressing to dining. He worked until late evening, often past midnight, during balls and special events. His bed was a mattress in a shared attic room. His wages were £30 per year, enough to live on modestly, but not enough to save much. Yet Wilson also describes moments of satisfaction. He took pride in the palace's beauty and his role in maintaining it. He witnessed historical events, foreign ambassadors arriving in magnificent carriages, aristocrats in their finest dress, glimpses of the royal family. He formed friendships with other servants, creating a community within the larger court structure. The class divisions at St. James's were absolute, yet sometimes porous. Senior servants, the groom of the stole, the master of the household, the senior ladies-in-waiting, were often from gentry or minor noble families, positions that carried genuine prestige and political influence. They lived in comfortable apartments, dined well, and moved in elevated social circles. Lower servants lived very differently. They ate simple food in servants' halls, slept in Spartan quarters, and had almost no contact with the royal family or high aristocracy they served. Yet the proximity to power, The reflected glory of royal service and the relatively secure employment made these positions desirable despite the hardships. Chapter 4. The Private Apartments and Family Tragedy. While the state apartments at St. James's Palace served ceremonial and administrative functions, the private apartments housed actual royal family life with all its complications, conflicts, and tragedies. George III, who reigned from 1760 to 1820, brought a new character to St. James's Palace. Unlike his dissolute predecessors, George was a devoted family man, deeply religious, interested in science and agriculture, determinedly British in his tastes and language. George and his wife, Queen Charlotte, had 15 children, creating a large royal family that required substantial private accommodation. While they primarily lived at Buckingham House, which George purchased in 1761 and Charlotte preferred to St. James's, the state apartments at St. James's hosted many significant family events. The most dramatic occurred in 1765, when George suffered his first bout of what was probably porphyria, a metabolic disorder that caused episodes of severe physical and mental distress. During these episodes, George would become confused, agitated, and sometimes violent. His treatment, which included physical restraints, bloodletting, and various useless medications, took place in the private apartments at St. James's, hidden from public view. Contemporary accounts describe the king confined to his rooms, sometimes strapped to a chair or bed, raving incoherently while doctors administered their futile remedies. Queen Charlotte and the royal children heard his cries through the palace walls. Court officials debated secretly whether he should be deposed in favour of the Prince of Wales. The illness eventually passed, and George resumed his duties. But the episodes would recur throughout his life, growing worse with age. During his final decade, George descended into permanent madness, blind and deaf, confined to Windsor Castle while his son ruled as Prince Regent. But those early episodes at St. James's introduced the royal family and the nation to the terrifying reality that their king's mind was fragile. George and Charlotte's children grew up partially at St. James's, though the family preferred the more comfortable and private Buckingham House and Windsor Castle. The eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, particularly detested the formal atmosphere at St. James's, though he was forced to attend court functions there throughout his father's reign. The Prince of Wales's relationship with his parents deteriorated into open warfare. George III was strict, moralistic, controlling. The prince was hedonistic, extravagant, rebellious. Their conflicts played out partially at St. James's, where the prince maintained apartments, and where he was required to appear for official functions, despite the mutual contempt between father and son. When George IV finally became king in 1820, after a decade as Prince Regent, he despised St. James's Palace so thoroughly that he refused to live there. He commissioned John Nash to transform Buckingham House into Buckingham Palace, creating a grand royal residence that would replace St. James's as the monarch's primary London home. But even George IV could not entirely abandon St. James's. It remained the official court, and he was forced to hold levees and other ceremonies there. The contradiction defined his reign. He hated the palace, but could not escape its symbolic importance. George's younger brother, William IV, who succeeded in 1830, had simpler tastes and initially considered living at St. James's. But the palace was increasingly old-fashioned, its Tudor and Stuart bones uncomfortable despite Georgian renovations. William ultimately continued using Buckingham Palace while maintaining St. James's for ceremonial purposes. The young Victoria, who became Queen in 1837 at age 18, made the final break with St. James's as a royal residence. She strongly preferred Buckingham Palace, which she expanded and modernized, relegating St. James's permanently to ceremonial and administrative roles. Yet St. James's hosted one of the most important moments of Victoria's early reign, her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. The ceremony took place in the Chapel Royal on February 10, 1840, with Victoria wearing a white satin dress and orange blossom wreath, establishing traditions that continue to influence weddings today. Contemporary accounts describe the chapel royal decorated with flowers and crimson cloth, filled with aristocrats in formal dress, the young queen nervous but determined as she spoke her vows to the German prince she loved. The ceremony was relatively intimate by royal standards. Only about 300 guests could fit in the chapel, but was witnessed symbolically by the nation through newspaper accounts and illustrations. Victoria and Albert's marriage transformed the British monarchy from the dissolute Georgian model into something more domestic and respectable. They had 9 children, maintained a relatively scandal-free court, and embodied Victorian ideals of family life. But they did this primarily at Windsor and at their private estates, not at St. James's, which increasingly became a relic of earlier royal styles. Chapter 5. Architecture and sacred geometry. St. James's Palace, despite its piecemeal construction over centuries, embodies architectural principles that reveal deeper meanings about power, divinity, and cosmic order. The original Tudor palace followed medieval building traditions where architecture was understood to reflect divine proportion. Although Henry VIII's masons worked in a pragmatic English style rather than the high Renaissance manner, they employed geometric relationships derived from sacred tradition. The main courtyards approximate squares or double squares, proportions believed to embody stability and perfection. The gatehouse rises 4 stories with octagonal towers, the number 8 holding symbolic significance as representing resurrection and new beginnings in Christian numerology. Henry was creating a new religious order with himself as supreme head. The octagonal towers silently proclaimed this revolutionary transformation. Inigo Jones's Queen's Chapel represents the first conscious application of classical proportional systems to St. James's Palace. Jones studied Palladio's treatises on architecture, which codified Renaissance proportional theory derived ultimately from ancient Greek and Roman sources. The chapel's interior proportions, a double cube measuring 60 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, create a space based on the ratio 2:1:1. A harmonic relationship Jones believed produced inherent beauty and spiritual resonance. The human mind, according to Renaissance theory, unconsciously recognizes these proportions as perfect, creating feelings of order and peace. The Venetian window on the chapel's east end also carries symbolic weight. The tripartite window, large central arch flanked by smaller rectangular openings, represents the Trinity, with the larger central section symbolizing Christ mediating between heaven and earth, the side windows representing the Father and Holy Spirit, or, in some interpretations, the relationship between divine and human nature. Christopher Wren's post-fire rebuilding brought another layer of architectural meaning to St. James's. Wren, trained in mathematics and astronomy before becoming an architect, understood buildings as exercises in applied geometry. His state apartments feature carefully calculated room proportions, ceiling heights based on the golden section, and window placements that optimize natural light while creating harmonious relationships between solid walls and voids. Wren particularly emphasized vertical proportions. The staterooms feature high ceilings, typically 15 to 18 feet, creating volumes that dwarf human scale and inspire feelings of awe. This was deliberate. Royal apartments should make visitors feel the magnitude of monarchical power, should create psychological effects through architectural means. The decorative programs in Wren's state apartments and later Georgian additions employed classical iconography with specific meanings. Ceiling paintings depicted gods and goddesses from classical mythology, but these were not mere decoration. Each figure represented virtues or concepts. Minerva symbolized wisdom, Mars represented military prowess, Venus embodied beauty and love, Jupiter signified sovereign authority. Royal visitors understood these references and could read the ceilings as texts proclaiming the monarch's virtues and divine right to rule. The architecture itself became propaganda, advancing political arguments through visual means. The Chapel Royal's decoration evolved over centuries, reflecting changing religious ideas. Tudor chapels featured relatively simple decoration focused on biblical scenes and royal heraldry. Stuart renovations added more elaborate ornament reflecting high church Anglican preferences. Georgian modifications introduced classical elements while maintaining Christian symbolism. The current Chapel Royal ceiling, dating from the mid-19th century, features coffering and ornament in a Renaissance revival style. The ceiling is divided into panels containing painted decoration and gilded moldings, creating a rich surface that draws the eye upward, a traditional architectural device for encouraging spiritual contemplation. The symbolism extends to materials. Gold represents divinity and incorruptibility. Blue, particularly ultramarine made from expensive lapis lazuli, symbolizes heaven and divine truth. Red signifies sacrifice and martyrdom. These colors appear throughout the palace's decoration, creating layers of meaning beyond their aesthetic appeal. Even the palace's brickwork carries symbolic weight. Tudor bricks were made from local clay, literally connecting the building to English earth. The reddish color was not just decorative, but symbolically significant. Red represented English identity, the blood of martyrs, the power and vitality of the Tudor dynasty. The gatehouse's position and design established symbolic boundaries between the public street and private royal space. To pass through the gate is to enter a different realm with different rules, different hierarchies, different laws. The massive wooden doors, the narrow passage, the presence of guards, all these make the transition tangible, transforming a simple architectural feature into a political statement about power and access. Modern visitors rarely think about these deeper meanings. They see old bricks, historic rooms, ceremonial spaces. But for those who built and first used St. James's Palace, every architectural decision carried significance, every proportion embodied meaning, every decoration advanced arguments about power, divinity, and the nature of legitimate rule. Chapter 6. Servants, Labour, and the Invisible Workforce. Behind the ceremonial splendour and architectural sophistication of St. James's Palace stood, and still stands, an enormous workforce whose labour makes royal life possible, but whose stories remain largely invisible. The palace's workforce varied over centuries, but typically numbered between 200 and 400 people when the court was in residence, with a smaller maintenance staff during periods when the royal family was elsewhere. The hierarchy was extraordinarily complex. At the top stood great officers of state, the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, the Master of the Horse. Aristocrats themselves who commanded departments and wielded significant political influence. These positions were sinecures awarded for political loyalty or family connections, paying substantial salaries for minimal actual work. Below the great officers came working officials who actually managed palace operations. The comptroller of the household oversaw day-to-day administration. The clerk of the kitchen managed food preparation and service. The clerk of the closet handled the chapel royal and religious observances. These men, they were invariably men for positions of authority, came from gentry or merchant families, educated, literate, capable of managing complex operations. Then came the skilled workers who made the palace function. The master cook commanded a brigade of specialists, sauce cooks, roasting cooks, pastry cooks, each trained through years of apprenticeship in French culinary traditions. The king's barber and his assistants maintained the elaborate wigs and hairstyles that Georgian fashion demanded. The yeoman of the wardrobe and his staff maintained the royal clothing, an enormous task given that monarchs might change clothes multiple times daily and owned hundreds of garments. Footmen occupied an interesting middle position in the hierarchy. They were servants, clearly, but they came into regular contact with royalty and aristocracy, required to be well-spoken and presentable. Footmen positions often went to younger sons of respectable families fallen on hard times, men who needed employment but possessed education and manners that suited them for visible court service. A footman at St. James's might earn £40 to £60 annually in the 18th century, plus room and board, livery clothing, and tips from courtiers. The work was demanding, standing for hours during ceremonies, running errands throughout the vast palace complex, attending on aristocrats who could be demanding or cruel. But it offered security and opportunities for advancement. Some footmen rose to become valets or grooms, positions of greater responsibility and much better pay. A successful valet might earn £200 annually, save money, eventually retire to establish himself in business or purchase a small property. Royal service offered a path to modest prosperity for those who survived the demanding work and avoided the temptations, drinking, gambling, inappropriate relationships that ended many court careers. Below the visible servants laboured an army of workers who kept the palace clean, maintained its infrastructure, and performed the physical labour that luxury required. Housemaids rose before dawn to clean fireplaces, empty chamber pots, scrub floors, dust furniture, and make beds. They worked silently and invisibly, trained to complete their duties before family and guests awakened. These women, mostly in their teens and 20s, earned £10 to £20 annually, sleeping in crowded attic rooms, eating simple food in servants' halls. The work was back-breaking, the hours long, the conditions often harsh. Yet many housemaids considered themselves fortunate. The alternatives were factory work, agricultural labour, or prostitution, all potentially worse. Laundry workers faced particularly brutal conditions. Georgian court life generated enormous quantities of dirty linen, shirts, shifts, tablecloths, napkins, sheets, towels. All had to be washed by hand using harsh soap and boiling water, dried and ironed with heavy flat irons heated on stoves. The laundry operated in basement rooms with minimal ventilation, the air thick with steam and soap fumes. Women worked 10 or 12-hour days, their hands raw from the soap, their backs aching from bending over wash tubs, their faces flushed from the heat. They earned perhaps £15 annually for this labour, barely enough to survive. Kitchen staff worked in slightly better conditions, but equally long hours. The kitchen complex at St. James's occupied substantial space in the palace's lower levels, multiple rooms for different types of preparation, storage areas for food and equipment, sculleries for washing dishes and pots. The hierarchy in the kitchen mirrored the larger palace structure. The master cook commanded absolutely, his word law in his domain. Below him, specialized cooks managed particular aspects of meal preparation. Below them, kitchen maids and scullions did the grunt work, peeling vegetables, washing pots, scrubbing floors, tending fires. A scullion at St. James's earned perhaps £8 to £12 annually for work that was hot, wet, and exhausting. Scullions were typically young men or boys, might start at age 12 or 13, working 14 hours daily, sleeping in a corner of the kitchen complex, eating scraps from the royal table. Yet even this harsh life offered opportunities. A capable scullion might advance to kitchen assistant, then to specialized cook positions, eventually perhaps to master cook if he possessed talent and ambition. The kitchen provided one of few paths for working-class men to rise through skill rather than birth. The stable staff represented another major workforce component. Dozens of horses required constant care, feeding, grooming, exercise, veterinary attention. Carriages and harnesses needed maintenance and repair. The master of the horse commanded this department, but the actual work fell to grooms, stable boys, and coachmen. These workers lived primarily in quarters above the stables, their days governed by the needs of animals rather than human schedules. Horses required feeding at specific times regardless of holidays or weather. Carriages needed to be ready whenever required, which might mean middle-of-the-night preparations for early morning departures. The work was dirty and sometimes dangerous. Horses kick, bite, and occasionally kill their handlers. But stable workers took pride in their skills, in the glossy coats of well-groomed horses, in carriages maintained to perfection, in the precision of their professional work. Beyond these regular staff, St. James's Palace required numerous specialized workers, craftsmen who maintained the buildings, artisans who repaired furnishings and decorations, suppliers who provided everything from candles to coal. Masons and bricklayers made ongoing repairs to the ancient structure, replacing damaged bricks, repointing mortar, maintaining walls that had stood for centuries. Carpenters repaired floors, doors, window frames, and wooden paneling. Plasterers maintained ceilings and walls. Glaziers replaced broken window panes. Painters refreshed decorative schemes. These craftsmen were not palace employees, but independent contractors, hired for specific projects. They earned higher wages than servants, perhaps 5 to 7 shillings per day for skilled tradesmen, but lacked the security of permanent employment. When work at the palace was complete, they moved to other jobs, their connection to St. James's temporary and transactional. The suppliers formed their own complex network. Butchers provided meat, greengrocers delivered vegetables and fruit, fishmongers brought fish from London's markets, wine merchants supplied the cellars, coal merchants delivered fuel for the hundreds of fireplaces. Each supplier held a warrant as purveyor to the royal household, a prestigious designation that enhanced their reputation and justified premium prices. These business relationships were hereditary, passing from father to son, across generations. The same families might supply St. James's Palace for centuries, their fortunes linked to royal patronage, their social standing enhanced by association with monarchy. The total cost of maintaining St. James's Palace and the court it housed was enormous. In the mid-18th century, the annual budget approached £100,000, equivalent to roughly £15 million today, though such conversions barely capture the true economic impact. This money supported not just the palace itself, but an entire economic ecosystem. The hundreds of direct employees, the thousands of indirect workers in supply chains, the businesses that depended on palace custom, all benefited from royal expenditure. St. James's Palace functioned as an economic engine, redistributing tax revenue through wages and purchases, while providing employment and opportunity for those connected to the court. Yet the benefits were distributed unequally. The great officers and senior officials lived comfortably, accumulating wealth through salaries and opportunities for corruption. The skilled workers and middle-level staff maintained respectable lives. The lowest servants and labourers struggled to survive on minimal wages, working brutal hours in harsh conditions, often ending their lives in poverty despite decades of royal service. This inequality was inherent to the system and largely accepted as natural order. The idea that servants might deserve better pay or conditions rarely occurred to their employers or to the servants themselves. Everyone knew their place, understood their role, and performed their duties within a social hierarchy that seemed as eternal and unchangeable as the brick walls surrounding them. Chapter 7. Decline, Adaptation, and Modern Legacy. St. James's Palace's role as a primary royal residence effectively ended with Queen Victoria's accession in 1837 and her preference for Buckingham Palace. But the palace did not become irrelevant. Instead, it adapted to new functions while maintaining its ceremonial significance. throughout Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901. St. James's remained the official seat of the royal court. Foreign ambassadors were accredited to the court of St. James's. Official announcements were made in the name of the court of St. James's. Levees and formal receptions continued in the state apartments, but the royal family rarely lived there. Victoria preferred Buckingham Palace in London, Windsor Castle outside the city, and her private estates at Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. St. James's became primarily an office building and ceremonial venue, its grand apartments used for official functions, while the residential portions housed court officials and minor royals. This transformation accelerated under Victoria's successors. Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 to 1910, maintained some use of St. James's for court functions, but preferred Buckingham Palace and his own properties. George V, who reigned from 1910 to 1936, continued this pattern. The two world wars accelerated changes. During World War I, from 1914 to 1918, St. James's Palace was partially converted for war-related uses. Some apartments housed military offices, others provided accommodation for soldiers on leave. The palace's ceremonial functions continued, but on reduced scale, appropriate to wartime austerity. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, brought even greater changes. St. James's Palace in central London faced bombing risks throughout the Blitz. Some sections were damaged by German bombs, though the palace survived better than many London buildings. The royal family evacuated to Windsor Castle, and St. James's was used for government offices and military purposes. After World War II, St. James's Palace found new roles that continue today. It houses several royal offices and organizations, including the Royal Collection Department, several charities and foundations, and accommodations for certain members of the royal family. The state apartments are no longer used for regular court functions. Modern royal ceremonies typically occur at Buckingham Palace, but St. James's retains specific ceremonial purposes. The Accession Council, which formally proclaims a new monarch, still meets at St. James's Palace. This happened most recently in September 2022, when Charles III was proclaimed following Elizabeth II's death. The Chapel Royal remains in active use, holding regular Sunday services that the public can attend by ballot. Royal christenings occasionally occur there, continuing the tradition of Victoria and Albert's marriage in 1840. The chapel's musical tradition continues, with professional choirs performing some of Britain's finest sacred music. Several members of the royal family maintain offices or residences at St. James's Palace. The Princess Royal has offices there. Various minor royals and court officials occupy apartments in the complex. The palace remains a working royal building, not a museum, though public access is extremely limited. This working status creates preservation challenges. St. James's Palace requires constant maintenance. Roofs leak, bricks deteriorate, plumbing fails, heating systems need updating. But modifications must respect the building's historic significance. You cannot simply gut a Tudor palace and install modern systems without destroying what makes it valuable. The solution involves careful, piecemeal work. Historic brickwork is repaired using traditional techniques and materials. Modern services are installed discreetly, hidden behind historic finishes, or routed through existing shafts and chases. The goal is maintaining the palace's historic character while ensuring it remains functional for current needs. This work is overseen by the Royal Household's Property Department, working with historic royal palaces, English heritage, and various conservation specialists. Every intervention is documented, every material choice justified, every modification reversible if possible. The costs are substantial. Maintaining a nearly 500-year-old building complex requires millions of pounds annually. The money comes from the sovereign grant, the funding mechanism that supports the monarchy, supplemented by private royal funds and for specific conservation projects, sometimes public heritage grants. The public debate about these expenditures reflects larger arguments about monarchy's place in modern Britain. Critics argue that spending millions maintaining palaces for royal use represents wasteful privilege in an age of austerity. Supporters counter that these buildings are national treasures, their preservation benefiting everyone through heritage tourism and cultural continuity. St. James's Palace occupies an odd position in these debates. It is not open to tourists like Hampton Court or the Tower of London, so it generates no direct tourism revenue. Yet it remains an important part of royal pageantry and British national identity. The proclamation of new monarchs at St. James's provides powerful symbolic continuity with medieval traditions. The palace also represents architectural heritage worthy of preservation, regardless of current royal use. The Tudor Gatehouse, Inigo Jones's Chapel, Wren's State Apartments. These are significant examples of British architectural history, documenting the evolution of building styles and techniques over 5 centuries. Modern conservation philosophy emphasizes preserving this accumulated history rather than restoring buildings to a single historical moment. St. James's Palace embodies this approach. Tudor elements coexist with Stuart additions, Georgian modifications, Victorian changes, and 21st century adaptations. The building tells a story that spans centuries, each era leaving its mark. This layered history sometimes creates aesthetic tensions. Should Tudor bricks be visible, or should they be covered by later plaster? Should Wren's Georgian decoration be preserved, or should attempts be made to recover earlier Stuart or Tudor schemes beneath? Should modern accessibility requirements override historic fabric, or should history trump contemporary inclusion? These questions have no easy answers. Conservators must balance competing values: historical authenticity, aesthetic coherence, functional requirements, accessibility, sustainability. Each decision involves compromises, choosing which values to prioritize while accepting that others must be sacrificed. The result is imperfect, but honest. St. James's Palace today does not look exactly as it did in Henry VIII's time, or Charles I's, or George III's. It looks like a building that has been occupied and modified for nearly about 500 years, accumulating changes that document evolving tastes, technologies, and uses. This accumulated history gives St. James's particular power as a symbol of British continuity. Unlike Buckingham Palace, which was largely rebuilt in the 19th century and feels like a Victorian creation, St. James's visibly connects to Tudor England. Standing in the courtyards, looking at brick walls laid by Henry VIII's masons, visitors can feel temporal depth in a way few buildings provide. Chapter 8. Conclusion: Power, Memory, and Survival. St. James's Palace stands today much as it has for nearly 5 centuries. Brick walls that have witnessed the full sweep of British history, from Henry VIII's break with Rome to Elizabeth II's record-breaking reign and beyond. The palace is not the grandest royal building in Britain. Windsor Castle is larger and more spectacular. Buckingham Palace is more famous and more important to contemporary monarchy. Hampton Court is more visited and better preserved as a historic site. Yet St. James's Palace possesses something these grander competitors lack: unbroken connection to the very foundation of modern British monarchy. Every British sovereign since Henry VIII has been proclaimed at St. James's. Every court circular still bears its name. The palace represents institutional continuity across nearly 500 years of revolutionary change. This continuity matters because it embodies a particular conception of political legitimacy. British monarchy claims authority not through military power or popular election, but through hereditary succession, validated by traditional ceremonial. St. James's Palace provides the stage where this ceremonial is performed, where abstract principles become tangible reality through ancient rituals. When Charles III was proclaimed king at St. James's Palace in September 2022, the ceremony followed protocols established centuries earlier. The Accession Council met in the palace's state apartments. The proclamation was read from a balcony overlooking Friary Court. Heralds in medieval tabards announced the new king to crowds gathered below. These rituals seem anachronistic, and they are deliberately so. They connect contemporary Britain to its past, asserting that the monarchy draws authority from unbroken tradition rather than momentary popular will. Whether this assertion is persuasive or absurd depends on your political philosophy, but either way, St. James's Palace provides the physical setting where the assertion is made. The palace also embodies the gap between monarchical theory and practice. In theory, British monarchs rule absolutely by divine right. In practice, they reign but do not rule, their power ceremonial rather than actual. St. James's Palace reflects this duality. It is simultaneously the official seat of royal power and a building where actual political power rarely resides. This has been true for centuries. Even when monarchs lived at St. James's, real power often lay elsewhere, with parliament, with ministers, with financiers and merchants whose economic clout dwarfed royal authority. The palace was a beautiful stage for performing monarchy, but the performance was increasingly separate from political reality. Yet the performance mattered and still matters. Human societies require symbols and rituals that articulate shared values and create collective identity. Monarchy, for better or worse, provides Britain with such symbols. St. James's Palace, precisely because it looks backward rather than forward, offers a sense of continuity that feels increasingly precious in an age of rapid change. The workers who built and maintained St. James's Palace across 5 centuries remain mostly nameless and forgotten. We know the architects, Henry's master mason, Inigo Jones, Christopher Wren, and others whose names survive in historical records. We know the monarchs who commissioned work and lived in the palace. We know the great nobles and politicians who attended court functions, but the masons who laid the Tudor bricks, the carpenters who built the roof trusses, the plasterers who created the decorative ceilings, the painters who executed the allegorical schemes, the servants who cleaned the rooms and tended the fires. These people appear in history primarily as anonymous labor, their individual stories lost. Yet their work survives. The bricks they laid still stand. The rooms they maintained still serve their purposes. Their labor created something larger and more enduring than any individual life, a monument that has outlasted kings and queens and will likely survive for centuries more. There is a certain democratic justice in this. The palace was built for monarchs who believed themselves divinely appointed to rule over common people, yet the monarchs are gone, remembered mainly through their connection to the building. The building remains, created by common people's skill and sweat, a testament to human capability that transcends the accidents of birth and status that determined who ruled and who served. St. James's Palace in the 21st century exists in a state of productive tension between past and present, tradition and change, symbolism and function. It is a working royal building that also functions as heritage site, a private residence that also serves public ceremonial purposes, an ancient monument that must adapt to contemporary needs. This tension will continue as long as the building survives and Britain maintains its monarchy. The palace will require constant work to preserve historic fabric while accommodating modern uses. The ceremonial functions will need periodic updating to remain meaningful to contemporary audiences while maintaining connections to tradition. Whether St. James's Palace will still perform these roles in another 500 years is impossible to know. Institutions that seem eternal can collapse with surprising speed. The British monarchy has survived revolutions, civil wars, global conflicts and social transformations that destroyed other royal houses. But survival is never guaranteed. What seems certain is that as long as St. James's Palace stands, it will continue speaking to visitors about power, tradition, and the complex relationship between the two. The Tudor bricks glowing in the London light, the ancient courtyards, the chapel where monarchs have worshipped for centuries. These physical spaces embody arguments about legitimate authority and social order that remain deeply contested. Walking through St. James's Palace, you walk through British history in 3 dimensions. You see the fortress Henry VIII built when he was remaking England in his image. You see the classical additions that proclaimed British sophistication and cultural achievement. You see the accumulated modifications that document evolving tastes and technologies. But you also see something less tangible, the ghosts of all who passed through these rooms across 5 centuries. Monarchs born and crowned and buried, aristocrats jockeying for favour and fighting duels over slights, servants labouring in obscurity to maintain royal splendour, craftsmen creating beauty that would outlast their names. These ghosts do not haunt in any supernatural sense. They haunt because the building preserves their choices and embodied their values. Every room, every decoration, every architectural detail represents decisions made by people long dead, attempting to create something meaningful that would survive their brief lives. In this, they succeeded. St. James's Palace survives, magnificent and flawed, important and contested, beautiful and troubling. It stands as monument to human ambition in all its complexity, the desire to create lasting beauty, to demonstrate power, to connect with tradition, to leave something behind that matters. The Atlantic wind that blows across. London carries the same questions that haunted the breakers across the ocean in Newport. What do we build to be remembered? What actually survives? And does survival validate the choices that created it, or merely demonstrate that buildings are more durable than the social systems that commission them? St. James's Palace offers no definitive answers. It simply endures, brick upon brick, century upon century, inviting each generation to interpret its meaning through their own values and concerns. The palace that Henry built to escape court life became the very symbol of courtly power. The fortress designed for privacy became the most public face of monarchy. The building succeeds by adapting, by serving purposes its creator never imagined, by meaning different things to different eras. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of St. James's Palace. Survival requires flexibility. Meaning evolves. And the monuments we create to express our values ultimately express the values of those who inherit and reinterpret them. The palace belongs now not to Henry VIII or Charles I or Queen Victoria, but to whoever walks through its courtyards and decides what these ancient walls mean for understanding power, tradition, and the human story they contain. The gatehouse doors still open, massive and medieval, admitting visitors to courtyards that have witnessed 500 years of British history. The Chapel Royal still echoes with music, continuing traditions established before Shakespeare was born. The state apartments still host ceremonies, performing monarchy for an age that scarcely believes in kings. St. James's Palace stands, testament to continuity and change, to power and its limits, to human ambition and human mortality. It will stand long after we are gone, speaking to future generations about an era when kings ruled Britain and palaces embodied their authority. What those future generations will make of these relics we cannot know. But the bricks will endure, the courtyards will remain, and the palace will continue telling its layered story to anyone willing to listen.